Right,
But like,
How do I comment on this? I probably have to wait for you to start.
I just started it.
Let me refresh.
Chris,
Are comments enabled?
Yes.
I had this
How do I
this
know?
problem where, for whatever reason,
So the
Google,
screen is
Google
not great
Chrome,
right now.
which is like the browser they use instead of like Firefox or Internet Explorer, the browser took over my computer's like audio capabilities. So it was like it was choosing what I could listen to, and so I had to go into the control. I did a lot of digging for this, and I'm a little tech savvy, so like, you know, if I had to do some digging, I feel like music like an iTunes or anything like that, or watch DVDs on your laptop or computer or anything like that. Okay.
I do every now and then do YouTube music.
But in that works, right, like straight from the laptop
I
screen.
may not have done it since the last time. I will, when I go home, I'll check. I'll play some tunes.
Right.
Yeah, I'm getting at it.
You good? Great. So thank you for the invitation to come out here and present to you all tonight. My name is Tracy Novick, and I am a field director with the Massachusetts Association of School Committees. And in fact, I'm your field director. We sort of share the Connecticut River Valley, Liz LaFont and I cover all of the region out as far as 495. I live in Worcester. I'm on the Worcester School Committee. And part of my responsibility for MASC is school finance. I'm a licensed school business administrator in Massachusetts. And in terms of breaking down how school finance works from the state perspective, the local districts, that's actually part of what I do. That tracking budget, figuring out the ins and outs of all of these kinds of changes. So part of what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is really a look in particular at the state funding formula and how in particular it impacts your funding here at Pioneer Valley Regional. And so this is kind of a two-part presentation. It walks you through how we come up with the what's supposed to be the adequate minimum level of funding for school districts in Massachusetts. And then also looks at how it is that the state then sorts out who pays for that, and then looking at particularly at your numbers here in the region. So, by the way, I want to compliment you on your lovely district logo on the pretty lovely. One of the things I'm going to refer to a lot, and those of you who are on school committees know, you hear a lot about is Chapter 70. It took me a while to actually realize that when we're talking about Chapter 70, the reference is actually to Massachusetts General Law of Chapter 70. It's actually the beginning of that law that actually says this, which is that it's the intention of the general court, subject to appropriation, to ensure fair and adequate minimum for student funding in public schools. So that is actually the section of the Massachusetts General Law that spells out how we fund
Try
schools in
moving
Massachusetts.
closer.
And so when we talk about Chapter 70, really all we're doing is making a reference back to the Massachusetts General Law. So in terms of
So like
that,
to see the
do
screen.
keep in mind that we're talking particularly about K through 12, pre-K through 12 aid. It is aid that can be used pretty much for any purposes within that parameter. There are, of course, other lines of aid that come to districts.
Sit right there.
Yeah, I think so.
So effectively, the way that this starts is with the question of what does it take to educate a child in Massachusetts? That effectively is the question that lies behind the first calculation that the state does here. And in putting those functional areas together, the state effectively does a review of the various pieces of what we in school committees actually consider when we're passing our budgets, right? We pay for teachers, we pay to keep the lights on, we pay to make sure that employees have health insurance. If you look down this list here, you'll see a lot of things that are familiar: professional development, instructional supplies and materials, and so forth. Taking each of those categories, there is actually a numerical amount that is assigned per pupil by grade in terms of this is the dollar amount to the state way back in 1993 when we created this formula, and then inflated by inflation over the years, says would be an adequate minimum for that student. So if you have a kindergartner, there's a certain dollar amount we think of associated with that kindergartner for central administration, for instructional leadership, which is principals, for teachers, for other teaching, for guidance and psychological services, and all the way down the list here, okay? So for this year, or rather I should say for this coming year, because we've managed to now get ourselves, we're halfway through one budget cycle, but we're already looking ahead to the next one. So next fiscal year starts July 1. The governor's budget came out a couple of weeks ago. And so what I'm giving you here are governor budget number, because as you as a community are considering your school district budget for next year, these are the numbers that actually lie behind that. So these are what we call the House 2, the second year of the legislative session. So this is House Bill 2 when the governor files it. For FY23, these are the various numbers per pupil that lie behind this foundation budget calculation that the state is doing. Now again, the state is just making a calculation of what does it take at a minimum to run a school district. You'll see that they partly go up grade by grade. There's obviously a higher amount for vocational because the notion is that the classes are smaller, the equipment needs are much more significant. Now, I'm going to mention this here, and you're going to hear me mention it a number of other times through the presentation. These numbers are being increased this year two ways. One, they're being increased by inflation, and we'll talk more about inflation in a minute, and that's usual. We've been doing that for the 25 years since education reform. The other thing, though, that has started to happen is that we're phasing in 6 years of changes to a number of parts of the foundation budget as a result of the Student Opportunity Act that was passed and signed in 2019. So this was the big education funding reform bill that I'm sure everyone heard about. A lot of people fought really hard for. And we are seeing those phases come in. So if you remember on the previous slide, part of what I listed here was guidance and psychological services. And another thing that's listed here is employee benefits and fixed charges. Those two categories are growing as part of the Student Opportunity Act. So these numbers are bigger this coming year than they were there this current year, in part because of inflation, but in part because included in each of these is an increment that's about guidance and an increment that's about health insurance, effectively. And so these are growing bigger than they previously would have simply according to inflation. So to this base amount, which is you've got a child who's sitting in a classroom, there's two increments that the state adds. One is for English learners, and the other is for low-income students. Now, much like with the original base amounts, these are based on your actual student enrollment. Okay, so in October, the district files a report with the state and says, here's how many students we have, here's what grades they're in. Part of that reporting to the state over the course of the year includes reports regarding the number of students who are English learners. And we'll talk a little bit more about low income because it's switching for at least the fourth time in a number of years. But this is a report of actual students is the thing that's important to know here. These are, again, the students that you had in kindergarten. They may also be English learners. They may also be low income. They can be in all three of those categories at the same time. So again, looking at the budget that's coming up for the coming year that starts July 1, the numbers that have been proposed by Governor Baker for English learners are here. You see that there's a three-part division. Something that I want to note, two things that I want to note too. The first is that this is another section that is affected by the Student Opportunity Act. There is a strong recognition by the state that we were underfunding the amount of additional support that's needed for English learners. And so these numbers, again, are not only going up by inflation every year, they're also going up by this additional, effectively what the state is going to set a goal that we're going to get to at the end of these 6 years. And so they're going up by an even amount towards that goal each year. The other thing that I want to point out, because we're starting to see this happen, we started the Student Opportunity Act in a year in which the legislature had done something a little bit weird, honestly, with the English learners. Personal opinion, but nonetheless. Usually these numbers were not quite in this system. They had agreed, however, in the year that they were actually debating the Student Opportunity Act, to a budget in which grades 9 through 12 was the lowest amount. And I can tell you that they did this because I actually have a very vivid memory. I happened to be doing the Belchertown superintendent search, was sitting at the Dunkin' Donuts when the Senate budget came out, and I read the Senate budget 3 times because I was sure that they had the number wrong. Yes, these are things that actually happened. So that then sort of threw off the whole implementation of SOA. Eventually, this number is actually going to be the largest, which if you think about how kids learn English, right, or any language for that matter, and if you think about developmentally and also how long we have with kids, it makes sense that the students that we're going to have for the least amount of time, that are also the oldest, presumably when they're entering learning English, are going to need the most amount of support. Effectively, this is changing to understanding that we get English learners at all kinds of grades and at all kinds of stages. Whereas in 1993, the assumption was that most of the students that we'd be getting who were English learners were going to be English learners because they were entering kindergarten, coming from a household in which English was not spoken as a primary language. Now, we have some of those students, but those are certainly not the only students that we have. This is actually coping with that reality. Another piece of the Student Opportunity Act, and frankly the one that has the biggest amount of money behind it, is the switch in terms of low income. Now there's actually 2 changes that are going on with low income. The first is that the actual count of students has been changing. Now it's changed a couple of times. And if you've been sort of watching this, you may remember that we were using the term economically disadvantaged for a little bit. What we had done for a very long time is we were counting kids as low income if they were eligible for free and reduced lunch. And districts did that pretty straightforwardly by the kids who turned in the forms for free and reduced lunch. Now, there was a great change back during the Obama administration as part of the Federal School Lunch Act, that if you had a certain number of students that could be certified by the state as being low income through some sort of state means, the federal government was prepared to reimburse your district at a rate that might make it possible for your district to actually feed all of your children for free. This very naturally was taken up by a number of the big cities first, right? Large number of kids, high proportion of poverty. Well, what that meant is that those districts stopped collecting the forms. Cost savings, convenient for them, but it meant that we had these sort of 2 ways of counting poverty for a while in the state. And then back in 2015, 16, 17, the state finally said, enough, we can't keep doing 2 things. It's getting crazy. We're not really counting the same groups of kids. So they switched everyone to what we call direct certification, which is that if students are in particular state programs like SNAP, Mass Health, and so forth, they count as low income. This requires some state level coordination because it means that state databases over on the Department of Public Health, or HHS, have to be coordinated with DESE, and they have to find the same kids in those databases. Consequently, there was a pretty significant drop in the number of kids they found, at least for the first couple of years. And consequently, there was a great amount of screaming that happened from the district level because suddenly we didn't have all of these low-income kids, right? Where did they go? Now, the state did increase the dollar amount, but still. As a consequence of that, in the Student Opportunity Act, there effectively was a DESE, you need to straighten this out. Like, we got to come up with one plan. How are we doing this? And so we had a 2-part phase-in. We had a part of the phase-in last year, which honestly was based on previous percentage rates. This year, we're changing again, but changing to what it's going to stay. It is that direct certification. So the child is somehow listed in one of those other databases as receiving state services. But there's 2 additional things. If a child is homeless, they are automatically counted. And there also is a provision for the district to be able to submit a form that says this student is not in your database, but we are attesting that this child is poor. And it's a little more complicated than that, but that's what it is. Consequently, the numbers have gone up again. Everyone seems to be a little bit more happy about how this is working. So that, obviously, because the count increases, has an impact on the budget. In terms of the dollar amount, this is actually where the biggest change is going to happen in terms of the foundation budget rates. So we're in year 2. This part is going to continue to get steeper, okay? This is about concentrations of poverty. The percentage of your student body that is considered low income is what determines which of the 12 tiers you're in by percentage, and they're not even. I was trying to call them duodeciles, and I got corrected by the deputy commissioner, so they're not even. But you are here, okay? You're in tier 7 in terms of the percentage of students that are in that are considered low income. That interestingly, that means that you're kind of right at the crux of where that steep slope starts to be. By the time we get done 4 years from now, in the full implementation of the Student Opportunity Act, this last tier is actually going to be equal to the middle school line that you saw before in the base rate. With the idea being that the state recognizes that it effectively is going to cost an additional 100% more for each student who is in the highest poverty districts who themselves are low. Okay, so that's coming in. I will say that in looking at the calculations, and I'll talk more about this in a second when we get to your stuff, I have seen some real changes this year. Last year, I got a lot of, you said this is gonna make a difference, there is a difference, kind of phone calls. This year, and one of my, you'll appreciate this because it's up along the northern tier here, the town of Orange is one of the ones that I always watch for. I think of Orange as being a baby gateway, right? They have a little bit of a mill town sort of in the center, and then they go out to country real fast. I did their superintendent search a couple of years ago. They had been right on the crux of actually seeing a real increase in their state aid last year. And they didn't quite kick over, and I'll talk about why in a second. This year is where the change happened. They flipped over into foundation aid, and now it's actually going to make a real difference in their school district, both this year and then moving forward. So I was shouting on Twitter about how excited I was about the town of Orange when I saw the foundation rates. For special education, this is the one that's the exception. This is not based on the number of kids you have in your school district that are in special education services. This is based on the number of kids you have in your school district, period. And then the state applies a percentage to your total enrollment. They assume that 1% of your students are in out-of-district services, and that this year, 3.86% of your students are in in-district services. What that is predicated on, I love that you're shaking your head right away, smart woman. What that is predicated on is the assumption, which is based on some degree of state data, that if they took all of your student population that has special education services, and they, I can't think of a better word than this, smushed them into receiving full-time special education services, because of course most of your kids who receive special education services are mainstream for most of their time, then it would be equivalent to these percentages, based on about 17 or 18% of your students being on IEPs. Yours are a little higher, I know, but that is what this is based on. There was, I'll tell you, battle royal when it came to fighting about this at the Foundation Budget Review Commission, which actually made the proposals. This is, again, there was a change, but it was based on DESE. This is eventually going to get to 4% for K-12 districts and 5% for regional low tax. So this is what those numbers look like for FY23. I always preface with the percentages because otherwise people get excited because the dollar amounts are big. And then I remind you again that it's an assumed rate rather than actually based on what's happening. So inflation. We actually have a good inflation year this year. And I say that as somebody who was on a school committee in this inflation year, which was not a good inflation year. In the inflation factor for the foundation budget, for most of the foundation budget, is keyed off of the state and local spending of the previous fiscal year, and it's a ratio that's based off of the third quarter. And so if you think about the kind of funding that's been coming to state and local municipalities, particularly federal funding, right, we're going to make sure that we don't tank the economy, we're going to make sure that we don't tank local government. Not exactly surprising, but we actually saw a pretty good year in terms of inflation. However, I've actually given you a footnote, which you may or may not be able to read. It's actually 4.5 because that's the cap. In the Student Opportunity Act, they have capped the inflation rate at 4.5%. If you actually use the real inflation rate, it would be 5.9. So, worthy of consideration. Hard to complain about 4.5, nonetheless, that's not actually it. Now, the one exception, remember I told you that health insurance was changing? This is actually where how health insurance is changing. Health insurance has its own inflation rate within the foundation budget now. It is tied to the statewide GIC rate, which is the General Insurance Commission that districts and municipalities can join. The 3-year average of the percentage. Now, amusingly, this year it's actually 4.51%, so it's only the difference. I will also venture to guess that that probably is nowhere near your actual inflation increase for next year, because it's just not anyone's. I know I heard my district budget last week, and I think we're looking at 8%. It is, however, better than it was in some of these other years when it certainly wasn't anywhere close to the percentage we were seeing. So keep that in mind. So then if we're putting the pieces together, we start with the base foundation calculations, right? We've got so many kindergartners and they have a dollar amount. There's so many first grade elementary schools, they have a dollar amount and so forth. To that we add the additional increments of English learners and low income. And then on top of that, there's the special education percentage, right? So that's the pieces of the calculation that are coming together for the foundation budget. Which means that for every district in the state, we end up with a spreadsheet that looks like this one. This happens to be yours, for us too. For FY23, the department refers to these as the preliminary budget estimates. We get one in January, and then once the legislature has done their work and the governor's actually signed the budget, we get another round of spreadsheets that are based on whatever the actually agreed to. In previous years, things usually have not been the same. It's possible that this year they might be. But you'll see, here's your count in preschool, kindergarten, elementary, middle school, high school, special education based on the percentages in district, out of district, English learners, 3 levels, low income, and the total number of students. For each of these, you're doing multiplication down to get to a total for each column, and those get added up down here for $8.1 million. Gave you it in an easier way to read, just taking out the enrollment, the per pupil cost, and then the totals if you multiply the second column by the third column. Do remember that if you try to do a total, you need to stop here because all the students who are here are also down here, okay? I've had that happen before where people have done that. I did that in italics. I also did delete all the columns with letter 0. So remember, that was the state's adequate minimum, okay? Now, I'm not gonna give anything away by telling you, the state also passed a funding formula reform in 2019, and they did that for a reason. So usually when I talk about adequate minimum, I do a lot of quotation marks around adequate, because the other thing is that there are probably less than 10 districts in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that actually run at their foundation budget, okay? Nearly everybody funds more than their foundation budget. So I'm gonna give you some numbers I'm sure that you are familiar with, but maybe you haven't seen in this context before. Keeping in mind that the foundation budget is a enrollment-driven formula, right? It's a per pupil, it's about the kids that are sitting in your building. This has been your enrollment over the past several years. And so this tells a story, right, about what the calculation is gonna look like for your foundation budget. If we've only got, if this is the number of children that we have, multiplied across those categories, then that's gonna have an impact on the foundation budget. That's just the way that the calculation works. The other thing, though, that I always like to look at is the selected populations, because of course, these actually then fund those increments as part of it too, with of course the exception of special education, which it is what it is. This is your English learners, okay? I do want to know, and I mean, I've scaled this so that I can put all of these on the same chart. And I say this, of course, as a Worcester School Committee member, right? 60% of our students are first language other than English. We usually have about 30% of our students that are learning English learners. I think the relative impact in a district like yours of going from 0 to 0.9 is a significantly larger impact than in a district like mine going from, say, 30 to 35%, right? So I always make sure that I couch that. I want to acknowledge, like, you went from 0.2 to 1.2 in the past year. That's a huge difference for you all, okay? And don't think that, that isn't noted and recognized. And I want to make sure that I say that because you should hear it from people like me. That makes a difference. I had a conversation with the superintendent of Spencer Springfield not long ago, and he was like, we've got to get a full-time English language educator. We haven't had one. We haven't needed one, but now we do. And of course, no, those kids never come, no kids ever come conveniently, and like all of them are in third grade, right? That'd be too easy. So that's a challenge. It's a real challenge for districts. This is your students with disabilities. Now, of course, this doesn't change your calculation at the foundation budget, but obviously it changes what you actually spend your money on. So let's note that. And then this, which, yes, bobs around a little bit, but remember there was a change in calculation that happened in the middle of this, is what your low income is like. Okay, and again, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but sometimes you don't necessarily see it in this context. And much like special education, although with a little bit of a change, this is going to actually impact your foundation budget, but of course it also impacts your spending. And again, there's a huge, huge change. Again, my district is 76% low income or something like that. My district going from 72 to 76%, not that much of a difference. Your district going from 19.5 to 37.7, that's huge. That's a really big difference. That also, by the way, means that you are shifting tiers on the foundation budget. So keep that in mind too. So here's what your foundation budget has looked like going back to FY10, okay? So again, this is just that first part of the calculation, the state's calculation of adequate minimum. This is, again, only half the equation, but I want you to remember what these bars look like and how they kind of move around, because this ends up mattering later in terms of your state aid. And I thought it would be useful for you to know that, as you're trying to cope with the changes from one year to the next, even from the state's perspective, as they're just doing that sort of flat calculation they do for everyone, there's some pretty significant changes that are in here, right? I mean, a year in which you went from $7.8 million to $7.4 million would be a big change, as would 8.5 to just about 8, right? So, if 8.1 is that fair and adequate minimum, where is that going to come from, right? So this is the other half of the equation. So the first part of this, and this, by the way, is easily the most complicated thing that I explained. I'm going to go slow, but also if you end up feeling somewhat lost, either stop me or don't worry too much about it. I think it's useful for people who have seen this. You're going to get at least a high level of it, even if the percentages don't necessarily stick with you. The statewide foundation budget, so the state does that calculation for every district in the state. If you added up all of those foundation budgets and came up with a statewide number, the state walks into every state budget season intending that 59% of that statewide foundation budget is going to be funded by local cities and towns. And the other 41% of that is going to be funded by the legislature, by the state government. So that's again at the state level. Obviously, the breakdown district by district is going to be wildly and radically different depending on the next part of the calculation. But just keep that in mind. This, by the way, didn't used to be written down anywhere. It's finally written into the SOA, but I actually scrambled all over to try to figure out it was just something everybody knew or didn't know. It's finally written actually into the Student Opportunity Act. So then the state says, okay, how are we gonna break this down to figure out? We've got to come up with $8.1 million for you all. We've got to actually fund all the other districts. Where is it going to come from? So they look at two things. They look, first of all, at the equalized valuation, which is the full and fair cash value of all taxable property in each municipality. And they add that up for the entire Commonwealth again. Okay, all taxable property, all cash value for all taxable property everywhere. Then the other thing that they look at is the income filings from, again, everyone who lives in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, derived annually from the State Department of Revenue filing. Now, I'll tell you, I'll point this out later, but just so you know, there's a little bit of a lag on each of these. They don't use sort of the current year numbers or last year numbers. They let some of the dust settle, shall we say, in terms of people filing extensions and all the other kinds of things people file with taxes. So that's the other half of it. Now, what they do is they take those two very big numbers and they set them equal to each other. So if you cast your mind back to when you learned decimals, you might remember that if you're going to take two numbers and you need to set them equal to one another, you multiply one of them by a number less than 1 and the other one by a number more than 1. And what they do is they come up with what the decimals are that would make these two numbers equal to one another. And then all we're going to walk away from this equation with is those decimals. Now again, did you need to necessarily know where the decimals came from? No, but now you do. So you're going to see them again, because what the state's now going to do is they're going to take those same decimals and they're going to apply them to the taxable property in every single town and apply this one to the income taxes from every single zip code. Okay, and that's actually the next part of the equation. So when they go to try to figure out how much every town and city can afford to contribute to public education, they look at, again, those two things, right? So it's this year, it's the 2020 equalized property valuation. And this is funny because it was 19 last year too. The 19 income tax. To that, they multiply by those percentages that we just got off that previous slide, okay? And again, they're doing this to every single city and town in the Commonwealth. And that gives you two numbers, right? It gives you what they call local effort from property wealth and local effort from income. Effectively, that's from the state's perspective, how much can the town afford to contribute to schools, given what they have for property wealth in the town, and given what they have for income wealth in the town. What they do then is they add those two numbers together, and that gives something called the combined effort yield. Now, I happen to be fond of the combined effort yield because it's one of the only ways that you can do something like compare, say, Northfield to Springfield in terms of how much they could actually afford to spend for public education. Because they do the same calculation for each, you apply that to their school district, you can get some idea of effectively what is their lift, what's their ability to be able to fund things. So, to look at your own, what they're going to do is they're going to take, again, in every single one of your towns, they're going to take the taxable property worth, multiply it by the same percentage that they got from the state calculation, and they're going to take the income taxes that were filed from each of the zip codes in the towns and multiply it by this percentage, which is the same one that we came from the state multiplication. You add those together, you get the combined effort yield. So, if you remember the very first slide, one of the things that Chapter 70 is supposed to do, along with calculating an adequate minimum funding mechanism, is it's supposed to come up with a standard of local funding effort, which is applicable to every city and town in the Commonwealth. And that's what this calculation is doing. It's the standard calculation. So, to put together a required local contribution, the state then starts by doing this. It takes your foundation budget, remember your 8.5. Now, this is how the calculation works. I'm going to talk about 8.1, but of course yours is actually broken down by 10. Yep.
Do you mind going back a slide?
Absolutely.
The notion of equalized valuation and taxable property.
Mm-hmm.
So in a town that has a large amount of its land area owned by government,
Yep.
or nonprofits,
Yep.
that town is at a disadvantage in terms of, that's not counted.
It's not counted. Yeah, that's usually the way I put it when I have people, particularly from Cambridge, who complain to me, right? It isn't counted against you, but it also then doesn't count for you, right?
And so when it's taxable property, so if you're in an area that has lots of businesses, is the property valuation about the land? Is it the land and the buildings on it?
It's usually both. Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Now, I'm gonna give a little bit of a nod, to one of your neighbors, because usually the complaint that I get out here, and I always remember this, is that, local effort from income wealth is done by zip code. I don't think I probably need to explain to you all that zip code in towns don't necessarily match. Yes, that has been a repeated conversation that we've had with the department. Unfortunately, not enough of them venture west of 495 to actually understand their rates.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Lying have two different zip codes.
Greenfield and Berniston zip codes.
Yeah.
Depending where you live.
Oh.
We have no post office.
So you're gonna head to how this impacts the assessment that's different for each town, so they go way up and way down in a
So
regional. You gotta
it's
get back for it.
right, so remember that that there's an interaction between the town, I don't go too much into that because there's actually an interaction between the town and DOR regarding their assessments.
Right.
So there really is, I mean, do people play games? Yes. Is there only so much play they can have? Yes, because DOR is actually on that, yeah. So, as I've been putting it together, what the state does, now I want you to understand that what I gave you was your regional calculation. The state also, behind the scenes, is running a foundation budget for each of your towns. They don't share that spreadsheet in the same way. What I am going to show you in a second is I'm going to show you what it does, because part of your calculation, I don't need to tell you this, but you're not only funding children who come to school here, you're also funding the school who goes to Franklin County Tech. That's the town's responsibility. So the town gets a calculation based on those kids, okay? So based on that, the state takes 82.5% of the town's foundation budget, and it compares it to the town's combined effort yield. Whichever of those numbers is less is the number that moves forward. Then what it does is goes back and it looks at how much the town was required to contribute the previous year. Okay, now my explanation for this was that they didn't want anyone to get sticker shock when they implemented this 1993. That's part of it. That's not the whole story, but that's part of it. And then there's one more fun decimal that comes in here. The state goes and looks at how much your local economy grew over the previous year. Okay, so this is the municipal wealth calculation. It multiplies that decimal by how much your town was required to contribute the previous year. And that's actually what they use then to move forward to say, okay, we came up with a target that we want you to be funding, but if all we do is take what you funded last year and we multiply it by how much your economy grew, how close are you to that target? Your target, remember, was just based on your foundation budget compared to your ability to fund. Now they're looking at sort of the more nitty gritty of how much did you actually fund and how much did your economy grow. They then do one more calculation because what they're trying to do is eventually get you to this target, which is either 82.5% of your foundation budget or your combined effort yield, depending on which is lower. In most of the cases that are local, there is some sort of an additional calculation. I'm not going to go too much into it, but really all it is it's based on how far away you are from your target. They may bring you a bit up or a bit down, more down, as I try to sort of chase that. So now I have the sheets for each of your towns, okay? I'm going to talk about each of them briefly, and the other thing that I have is I have the calculation then about how each town is required to contribute to both of the regional districts that they belong to, okay? So just taking Bernardson, okay, here's your familiar 0.3624%, right? $248 million of equalized valuation in 2020. For income, $66 million, and that's going to be multiplied by that 1.524 number, right? So you've got a local effort from property wealth of about $900,000, a local effort from income of about $1 million, add together 1.9, okay? So that's your combined effort yield. That's the state saying, here's how much we think Bernardson can afford to contribute to education. Now, for the town of Bernardson, the foundation budget is $3.4 million. If the state had you do the maximum contribution, that would be $2.8 million. But you've only got 1.9, right? So they're going to take the lower number. Yes.
Sorry, if you could slow down for a second.
Absolutely.
So the combined effort yield was 1.9 something million.
Yes.
the foundation budget was calculated with the number of kids plus the different categories of kids and grade levels that they're at, multiplying it, here's that amount.
Yes.
And the maximum local contribution was determined by, say again?
So it's just 82.5% of the foundation budget.
Okay.
So the secret I'm gonna give away here, and this is not going to apply to any of the towns here, is that every district, even if they can fully fund their foundation budget, gets some sort of Chapter 78. So effectively, there's an internal cap to required contribution, not to actual contribution, but to required contribution of 82.5%. What that says then is every district is gonna get at least 17.5% of their foundation budget to state aid. That's why there's Chapter 78 going to everybody. You can like it or not like it, but that's actually how it is. So that's what's going on with that calculation. It honestly doesn't make that much of a difference for any of you all, because in every case, the other, I think, is the lower. So what's your target share? What this is looking at your foundation budget. Effectively, then, what is the target local contribution as a percentage of your foundation budget? This is taking your foundation budget, what is the percent that you can fund? Okay, so for the town of Bernardson, effectively the split with the state as a target, the thing they're aiming for, is 55%, 55.5% of that coming locally, with 44.5% coming from the state. Now that's the target. So then we get into, okay, but where are you actually? For last year, Bernardson was required to contribute $1.7 million. Again, remember, not all of that came here. Municipal revenue growth factor for the town of Bernardson was 3.1%. So multiplying those numbers together, you get to $1.8 million. So how much of that is your foundation budget, right? That's 52.25% of your foundation budget. But your target was 55.5. So the state's gonna bring you up a little bit to try to get you closer to that 55%. And this it actually explains what it is, right? Depending on how much your shortfall is, they're either going to bring you up 1% or 2%, depending on how much of the shortfall there is. So if it's a particularly large shortfall, if your shortfall is greater than 7.5% of your foundation budget, they're going to add an additional 2% here. If it falls between 2.5 and 7.5, they're going to bring up an additional 1%. So in your case, right, so that's the calculation that they're doing here. And we do all of that math to discover that they're actually not going to add anything after all, because the difference is so small. Okay? And I know that was a lot. That is, again, as I said, this is easily the most complicated part. The part that I think that matter is, what is the state considering when it decides how much you can contribute? It's looking at your property wealth, it's looking at your income wealth. It's applying a standard calculation across the state when it actually figures out how much of that you can afford to contribute. And then it does a calculation effectively saying it's kind of either that, or it's the maximum contribution we can take, which is 82.5%. And then this calculation really is just based on how close are you, based on what you're actually doing. So taking that contribution and parsing it out across the two districts, this is actually looking, what it always gives you the prior year foundation calculation, so this is FY22. Looking at FY23, this is looking at your enrollment for each district, the foundation budget in terms of that town's foundation budget for that district, right, subdivisions here. How much of your town's foundation budget is going to go to that district, right? So about 85% coming here, about 15% going to Franklin County Tech, and then dividing up that $1.8 million. You've got 1.5 coming here, 2.75 going there, and there's a calculation of the net change for each of the towns. So we can walk through each of these individually if you want, or we can say this is pretty much the same thing. Yes, it is. Yes.
So you're doing a great job explaining this.
Thank you.
The whole harmless.
We're gonna get there.
Okay.
Because hold harmless isn't go to the town, it goes to the district.
Right. Okay.
Yes. We'll get there. Absolutely. Because that is a large portion of your story. Quite literally, actually.
Yeah.
So just, again, same calculations, right? So for the town of Leiden, it's $95 million in equalized property valuation, $22 million in income, same calculation, same multiplication. Combined effort yield, how much can you afford to give? $681,000, almost $82,000. So the foundation budget for the town of Leiden, given the students that are there, $660,000. The maximum you can contribute, see, I was wrong. Maximum you can contribute is $4.45 million. And that actually is the smaller of the two numbers, that 82.5. So that's the one they take. Target local share then for the town of Leiden is actually 82.5%. Leiden is actually that community. See, we got knowing nods. It's actually really good, by the way, to know this stuff about your towns, because there are lots of districts that are lopsided. Okay, and when the numbers are relatively, if all of the numbers were sort of the same size, it would be one thing, but because the numbers are so different, it's hard to tell. So knowing which of your towns are sort of the maximum contribution towns versus the towns that are, say, getting half of their contribution in state aid is actually is I think a significant thing to know in a regional district. So required contribution previous year, $508,000. Local revenue growth, 3.35. Multiplication then gives you 3.2, 5.5, which may look quite similar to your target local contribution. So we're going to try to do the change. We're not actually going to make any change in that either. So the contribution for the town is actually going to stay right in the same neck of the woods here. So I thought this one was actually pretty fun because this you can actually see what difference it makes to have a kid graduate, right? Leiden doesn't have a kid graduate check. That whole column disappears, right? Okay. And so then what difference does it make in terms of the town's contribution to one of its two regional districts, but also realize that the state is also then making a calculation based on then the apportionment of costs.
Are you going to show the actual?
The actual breakdowns, no, because there's a 2-year lag on it. So the chart that I didn't get to, that I wanted to do, was I wanted to do last year's actuals because I do it at the end of the year. And I gotta tell you, I honestly just ran out of time today. But I want to do that, and I'm actually going to send you the PowerPoint that will have that on it because they were very nice to me and actually sent me those end of year numbers, and then I didn't get to that chart. Because it is interesting to see sort of how the layers go together. Okay, so Northfield, $517 million is the property valuation. Our friendly same decimal here, 0.3624. $94 million in income, same uniform income calculation, 1.2242. So your combined different yield, given each of these, so it's 1.8 here, 1.4 from income, is 3.3. The foundation budget for the town of Northfield is $4.4 million. So the maximum local contribution is 3.6. Lower is back to combined different yield on this one. Okay, so if the lower is the combined different yield, you can make a pretty good assumption that we're going to end up with a target that somehow is different. The target for the town of Northfield for the local contribution is for Northfield to be contributing about 75% of their foundation budget and the state to be kicking in the remaining 25%. So how much did the Northfield need to contribute last year? They were required to contribute $3 million. Local municipal revenue growth factor is a little bit lower than some of the other ones you've seen, 2.94. So the preliminary contribution is 3.1. Notice that this is actually 70% of the foundation budget, and the target is actually 75. So there's actually there's a bigger difference there, right? However, it's still small enough that they're actually not going to make a change. Okay. They always do the math, though. I mean, I know it's a spreadsheet, so no one's actually doing it manually, but everyone's like, yeah, good try there, guys. Like, you're keeping it up. So, in terms of this, now, Northfield gets a fun little wrinkle because they actually get their own column. And I actually had to send in a question to make sure that I knew what was happening here. Does anyone actually know? You might, because it might have actually come up with county name. Okay, so this is what happens if a student chooses to attend a regional vocational school for a program that isn't part of the vocational school that they're actually a member of. So it's not school choice, right? Where do they go locally?
Franklin.
So Franklin, they're actually members.
Franklin Tech, but if Franklin
Like
Tech
Smithville
doesn't
or
have.
something.
Smithville or something, okay.
Smithville, yeah.
Yes, okay, so I was gonna say, with us, it's always Norfolk Aggie, and they always are studying horses, so it's probably Smithville, and they're probably still studying horses.
Yeah.
It's always horses. I can't blame them, I think horses are cool. Anyway, so that's its own column, that's how Northfield ends up with an actual student all by itself. It's because they're sending that student to another vocational school. So, you get that student all by themselves, you get the contribution to Pioneer, you get the contribution to Franklin County. Notice obviously that there's differences in each case from year to year. And then there's also here the apportionment of how much of the town's foundation budget of that $3.1 million is going to each of the respective schools. And then totals here on the end. Okay, so I'm glad you got me those, because I think that's a fun little one. By the way, that of course only happens with regional districts that have someone do that, right? So if I have a student school choice in Worcester, or do that in school in Worcester, like go to Norfolk Aggie, it comes out of the school budget. We just actually vote it. It's not actually, it's a little column. Anyway, Warwick, $82.4 million.
Just one quick, comes out of school budget through chapter 70?
Comes out of the school budget. I think we actually voted. Let me double check that.
Really? Okay.
Because I mean, all
We just
Worcester,
tuition it.
we don't actually, because there's no, with all Worcester kids are Worcester kids. Like we don't actually have one of those breakdowns.
Oh, right,
So
yeah.
they just belong to us and we just send the money. Yeah. And in particular, we then pay for the transportation because that's what they'll get you, as you all know. So $82.4 million for equalized valuation, same uniform property valuation, $18.9 million in income, same 1.5242 for the income percentage, giving us a combined different yield of $586,000. The foundation budget for, again, the town of Warwick is $864,889. So your maximum local contribution for Warwick would be $17,000. However, right, which is lower, the combined different yield is lower, so we're going to take that 586. That is only 67.87% of the foundation budget for the town of Warwick. So that's the target for what Warwick should be aiming towards funding, with the contribution from the state aiming towards being 32% of their foundation budget. Last year, Warwick contributed $525,000. Small municipal local revenue growth factor, right, 1.25. So the preliminary local contribution then is only going to go up by that little nudge there, 531,000. And so preliminary percent is still only 61%, right? So we're going to do a calculation down here. It's going to go up by $5,251. There actually is an increase here, okay? So that's what you, and then we'll end up seeing on the next slide. The Warwick has students going to both Franklin County and Pioneer. And you can again see sort of the division here in terms of where they are. Foundation enrollment, foundation budget, again, for each town, the percentage that each of the regionals gets from that town foundation budget, and then the required local contributions. Okay, so going back to your budget and putting those and putting together what the local contribution for the totality of the regional school district looks like. Okay. We've got this contribution coming in from Bernston, $1.5 million, $530,000 coming in from London, $2.7 million coming in from Northfield, and $4.49,000 coming in from Warwick. Okay. Together, that is your local contribution. So we think of it as individual pieces, and the state does a calculation that way. And then when the state goes to put the regional budget together, it takes those numbers, puts them together to come up with, okay, so this is the local contribution in totality for this school district. Note, by the way, that it does the same thing, only with many more arms for Franklin County Tech, right? That they're actually getting, in most of those cases, they're getting sort of the other piece of those town pies, plus the rest of their list all the way down. If I had lots and lots and lots of time, I would have made you that pie chart. I don't have a slide that has that many Lego arms. but the same kind of calculation happening there. So what the state then does to figure out how much state aid you're getting, remember, at the end of the day, they want to get you to that $8.1 million. That's been the whole goal here. That's what they've been trying to do since the beginning of this calculation. So they're going to take all those local contributions, they're going to add them up, and they're going to fill the gap between that total, that sum, and that $8.1 million. Okay, so this is each of the contributions you just saw added together, but $8.1 million is up here at the top, just about. Yep. So the other $2.9 million to get you to the 8.1 is foundation aid. Now notice I didn't say it was chapter 78. This is your foundation aid, because it gets you to foundation. So your foundation is $8.1 million, $2.9 million of the funding coming to you from the state is foundation aid. We clear so far? We got ourselves to $8.1 million. Now, remember, from a chapter 70 perspective, we have completed our plan because we have just come up with an adequate budget for pupil. We've done a standard calculation for every city in town, and then we got you to your adequate budget. However, as several of you have noted, this is actually not where your story ends. Okay, there is more to the story here and a lot of other places. So, remember this. Remember how we thought about what it might be like, and some of you might have even done part of that, coming from a budget that looks like this to a budget that looks like this, or a budget that looks like this to a budget that looks like this. The state is familiar with this notion, right? They're the ones who are doing the foundation budget calculation. And remember, if that's what your foundation budget looks like, you don't necessarily have to run the calculation in your head to know, okay, but if the state's calculating, if the state's contributing 55% of my foundation budget, or even 17.5% of my foundation budget, that's potentially going to be a pretty significant difference going from here to here, right? It's, for one thing, going to actually be less money. Now, I have a little bit of a cynical version of this. You can take it for what it is. Part of my theory on all of this is that the legislature doesn't like to come and tell you that you're getting less money than you got the year before. So they actually now passed a law that says that they're not going to do that. We used to actually have a fight about it annually, now actually written into the Student Opportunity Act. And that's what hold harmless is. Hold harmless is saying, by your foundation budget, by the calculation that's actually that standard chapter 70 calculation, you would be getting less money from the state. Your foundation budget has gone down, the state aid, the foundation aid, likewise has gone down. Of course, not surprisingly, in most of your districts, there's not necessarily going to be a big change in terms of the target. So 55% of this number versus 55% of this number is going to be lower. That's what's going to happen. Okay. So hold harmless is making sure that that doesn't happen. So you will not receive less aid than you got the year before. And this part is also written to the Student Opportunity Act. Every district receives at least an increase of $30 per pupil. Now, for a district that's actually getting an increase in foundation aid, most of the time that's where that is, right? City of Worcester, we're a foundation aid district. We are funded 2/3 by the state government. We are getting more than $30 per pupil in our foundation aid increase. But if you're not, the state does an extra calculation to make sure that that's actually included. So, looking back at your chart again, right? You've got your towns contributing here along the way. Then you've got your foundation aid, your $2.9 million. And then you've got the state saying, yep, but we want to make sure we give you as much aid as we gave you last year. So that's another $1.2 million. That's your hold harmless aid. That's saying you're not going to go backwards in terms of how much chapter 70 you get. And then they do a calculation and say, your increase is going to be at least $30 per pupil. You won't see it, but I did make it its own color. $19,000 on top of that, okay? So that's the whole calculation for you in terms of how the state aid happens. Now, you are not alone. You cannot, of course, read this. That's fine. The point is to actually demonstrate how common this is, okay? This is actually 22. This is the current fiscal year. I haven't run it yet for 23. I have a feeling possible it might change between now and June, and I always feel a little disheartened when it changes. This, by the way, does not actually include all of them. Because if I put Boston on, it throws out the whole chart. Yes,
Tracy, I didn't do hold harmless plus minimum, I did minimum.
Yep.
FY '23. And what I noticed was that maybe, when the spreadsheet, when I ran the calculation, let's say the top 35, 40 districts that got the minimum.
Yep.
But, so we got the minimum, all we got was, $30 a people, 19,000. Most of them were small and rural.
yes,
So, there was a webinar, Roger Hatch did a webinar on Monday with somebody else. And I typed that into the chat, so when I look at this, it looks like there's an overrepresentation of small and rural districts. And he poo-pooed the question.
oh, so let me tell you about a conversation our CFO in Worcester, Brian Allen, is actually one of the people who teaches school business administrators how to do their jobs. And I was putting this presentation together this afternoon. I took a picture of your enrollment and I sent it to him and I said, one of the questions I'm going to get tonight is tell me about whole harmless. Because he said, you've actually just explained it. If you've had dropping enrollment steadily, which is, you all know this has been one of the main conversations everybody's had in Franklin County and Berkshire County and pretty much everybody north and west of me. If you have had that, the state has been making sure that you don't drop in aid. You necessarily then have been building up hold harmless over time. And that is, so if you have a dropping enrollment, you have gotten hold harmless every year. You never lose any of that hold harmless, it accumulates. And that has been the story of most of our rural districts. So you are absolutely correct, and you should not have poo-pooed you. In fact, I'm kind of surprised you did. I wonder if you didn't understand the question correctly. Because Desi's actually done projects on it. The previous deputy commissioner, wrote a report about rural districts, and part of the conversation was, and these are the districts that have a lot of hold harmless data, we need to have a conversation about that. Because of course, from your perspective, what this looks like is, well, we only got a $19,000 increase last year. What happened, right? Well, I can tell you what happened. No, it doesn't really help you all that much, except understand why. The next part might help you a bit. And this is where I'm actually a little frustrated myself that I ran out of time, because I usually try to put these two charts together. So this is your required local contribution for the last number of years, right? This is your chapter 70. This is both halves, right? This is both the hold harmless and the foundation aid, plus those increments in terms of increases. Keeping an eye on that and how it relates to this, which is your foundation budget, is the story of the next number of years for you. Yeah. So usually I try to actually give you this perspective on it that actually goes back a little bit longer. The state's been doing us a favor these last couple of years and actually been giving us the chart on the bottom of your summary chart, right? Okay. So the story of the next couple of years for you all is here. Okay. I got a very frustrated email from the chair of the Mohawk Regional School Committee. Anybody else know Martha Ferber? She's fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And she said, you told us that we were going to have a difference because of the changes in the foundation budget. And we still are only getting this. They had the same thing happen that you did, okay? Now, did you get more money than you would have gotten? No. Is there a real difference here between the story of last year and this year? And in particular, the story of previous? Yes. Let me tell you so I checked this when I get this question. This is when I got my email from Martha, I pulled up in this chart for Mohawk, right? Similar kind of picture. This is actually what I checked for you all, okay? So if you have, your foundation is what you're required to spend. If you get additional aid, the state says, you gotta actually spend that on education too. Now that's not a big deal for y'all, your regional school district. It's not like it goes anywhere else. Nobody tries to spend that on, sewers or whatever. Unless you do, but that's a different story. So last year, you were at 125% required net school spending. That means that you had to spend 25% more than your foundation budget. Now, you didn't have to come up with that. That was actually that state aid that you got that was the whole harmless and minimum contribution. This year, you're down to 15, okay? That's a big difference. Now, it doesn't help you in terms of putting your budget together, but to me, that's this story, okay? Now, am I going to tell you that you necessarily are going to fight your way out of the other whatever it was, $1 million of hold harmless in the next, well, you got 4 years. You might, depending on it. Some of it's going to depend on your poverty rate, okay? Because as your foundation budget here, you're working your way out of all this hold harmlessly. When you get out of your hold harmlessly, that's when you, yay! I love that noise. Was that
When they were going, I'm sorry, I'm gonna just.
No, I'm so
When they
sorry.
were going through on that webinar, people were saying, oh, look at my chart. And he kept, I'm your interim superintendent, and I don't know much of this stuff.
That's okay. Oh my gosh, that's so common.
Okay.
Are you kidding?
You're saying that again in a loud
No,
voice.
there are business managers that can explain this. I'm not kidding. The state's actually doing a presentation like this for business managers the first week of March because most of them can explain it.
Right.
And here's the thing. If you're a district where you're only getting 17.5% of your foundation budget in aid, what do you care? But now you have school committee members who are saying, we did all that work to pass this. How come we're not seeing more state aid? And now you have to be able to explain it.
Okay.
Now, in some cases, you call Tracy Novick to your presentation, but in other cases.
Yes. Now, okay, so people were saying, show my district.
Yeah.
And those numbers on the bottom, 125% for us last year and 115. When the districts were like almost exactly at 100%, he sounded happy.
Yes.
Say again why he sounded happy.
Because that's when, so my district gets real increases every year because all of our increases are foundation. Our population is going up, it's gonna get picked up by the state.
Right.
You've got to actually
Hold harmless.
You've gotta work your way.
Hold harmless.
Yes, you gotta work your way through that $7 million or so in order to get to, okay, now any increases in your foundation budget. And remember, the other half of the story of this is that the foundation budgets are going up not just by inflation anymore, but they're going up by all those other little increases that I added, including the bigger increases in low income. And because you're a district, you're a tier 7, and that might still be changing, but because you're tier 7, those are going to be pretty substantive. They're not going to be enormous the way that they are for Brockton or Chelsea, but they're going to be pretty substantive. The foundation budget gets bigger, this line is going to continue to angle its way up, and there's a decent chance that you fight your way out of the hold harmless and get into real aid, which is what I explained to Martha, and I haven't heard back, so I don't know if actually I'm any.
But that's why districts like the Milani do. They're getting what, 565 or 460?
I haven't looked, maybe.
They're getting a lot of money because of the poverty. Right.
And this is why I was excited for Orange, because Orange last year was like here. And it was one of those where, like, I forget what we were fighting for. There was some calculation, we wanted them to change how they were counting low income. And I did the calculation. Orange would have been a foundation aid district last year if we had done that one change. As it was, they switched this year.
And you said be a foundation aid district because they don't have any hold harmless.
Yes.
So this probably makes sense now. Let me just make this statement because I've been doing the 6-town regional.
Yes.
This will probably make sense now. So since Pioneer is in hold harmless and Gil Montague just got out of it because of their aid. Okay.
Yep.
So let's say they're getting $1 million more and we formed a new district. Their $1 million would go away, but the state would look at it to say, well, your additional money is getting eaten up by how low Pioneer was below. So they still look at it like we're giving you the money, but you're not really getting it because it's being absorbed by Pioneer's.
And so some of this is going to also then be time sensitive, right? In terms of at what point are we at implementation? It is absolutely possible to run a foundation chart that's a combined district. You have all those numbers, and then to actually then run what the contributions will look like. Because you just effectively sort of take all of the pieces out of the chart and run them for this different recreated district. So yes, and honestly, this has been, I would say, one of the things that has really plagued a lot of conversations around, well, could we go regional, could we not, right? I've done this presentation twice in Granby. Granby's a single town district. They're surrounded by districts that, first of all, are not largely hold harmless, and also contribute significantly more over foundation. They can't find anybody who wants to partner with them, right? Because they're completely different financial planet, really. Okay, so this, to me, is your story right now. And what happens from here and where does this line go is really the question. And remember, it's the SOA that's actually pushing this. I mean, that's why this was sort of like flat, and then went up. This is actually not really about your enrollment. This is about the Student Opportunity Act. Okay, and everybody's foundation budget looks like that. And then it's a question of how that interplays with, in particular, their state aid.
But there's winners and losers. The winners are those districts that have an increase in their enrollment.
Well, as I know, I'm talking, I mean, granted, obviously, our numbers are ridiculous in Worcester, but I'm looking at a $30 million increase.
Yeah.
And we had another 300 students drop.
Yeah.
But that's the poverty rate. That's the poverty rate. Okay, so the poverty rate is actually gonna, it really is the story. As much as the other pieces are in there, the poverty rate really is the story when it comes to student opportunity act implementation.
So that would include the poverty of kids that are being choiced out,
Yes.
right? The factors in.
Or choice in.
No, choice in, they
No.
count with their home district.
Right.
Oh.
Choiced out is what hurts.
Yes. Yeah, choice and remember charter is actually in your foundation budget too.
It's a great presentation.
So I then do actually have the numbers to say, okay, but here's what your budget looked like last year. I did not do that chart, I apologize. But this is actually the point that I wanted to get you to, because from my perspective, in terms of what you need to know about state aid, this is the part of the story that actually really matters to you. And again, all of these numbers are part of that same spreadsheet that's on the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's website. It's the preliminary FY23 numbers. And then the charts that I did earlier that said how many people do we have, that's just taking stuff off of Desi's profile page.
So do you go to the next level where they do the foundation and they do the 5-year rolling average, you know, in the agreement to do the assessments out to the town?
So I don't, although I'm gonna have to, because I just scheduled, Berkshire actually just asked me to come out and be part of that conversation for them. Because every regional agreement is different.
Right.
So, you know, when I start getting into that, I honestly tend to defer to the business manager and say, so then what's the next step? Because what the next step is totally depends on what your regional agreement is.
Right.
Because the regional agreement also determines how the transportation is calculated.
And of course, that's not included in here at all.
That's not here.
But it's in our, like,
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. And obviously it's a real cost and it has, you know, real impact, and everything from, the reimbursement rate to everything else has an impact. And of course, this year, the story on that is that they're using the year that we run as many buses to reimburse you for and so on. So yes.
So I have a question understanding why Desi is pushing further regionalization. Yeah.
It bluntly
Yeah.
is because they don't know what else to do for tiny districts that have shrinking enrollment, where the costs are effectively not well sustained, even potentially by a reformed foundation budget. So I think that from their perspective, when they're looking at many of the districts in the state, they're saying, if we get you to foundation, is that sustainable? Yes, we think so. I think their concern is that there are districts that continue to have declining enrollment, where even with the increases in the foundation budget, it's not going to get you to a place that's fiscally sustainable.
20.
No, I don't know what they're going to do.
But then in areas like this one,
Yes.
there's the transportation.
Oh, I was going to say, then they haven't solved the transportation problem, and they seem not to really want to talk about transportation other
And
than
that will add costs.
yes.
I think they're looking at economy of scale, and that if Pioneer has a $14 million budget, another district has
Yes.
something, and you say, well, if you put that together and you get 36 million, what could you do with the 36 million for programs and services to give?
With the assumption being that then you only need one superintendent. I mean, there's only
Right.
so much you can combine.
Smaller part of the cost.
But you won't, right, and yes, the cost
Money is.
only works for some parts of it. I'm sure, I know that part
Yeah.
of it is you only want to depend on what superintendent. And I also think that there is a concern of if you have a high school that is as small as some of these are, can you actually do the same thing you could if you're, you know,
Right.
new
Double
staff?
size.
Right. Yeah, that's what we're working on right now.
Absolutely.
There's 4 of us.
Yeah,
in this
4 of us
room.
right
There's
here.
probably 6 now.
Well, I'm glad, because I mean, you know, and this really, as noted, this really is part of the story, right? And it's not to say this is off the table because of that, but it's to say that maybe timing goes into this too, in terms of how people's exit from home promises work.
I've been dealing with this for years. years, but it really came into play with me when I started looking at like what happens if it formed a new district.
Yeah.
And my whole understanding of this actually got better because I could see how that would become a whole different animal. And in some areas, very disappointing.
Yes.
You know, in others, so that helped my understanding and thinking more. But yeah, this is a problem.
Yeah, so we had a joking agreement that we were gonna regionalize non-contiguously with Acton Boxborough, which would get them, which would get them out of full harmless and get us regional transportation reimbursement. I don't know, I mean, you know.
The other odd thing, just to throw it out, someone wins $350 million in one of these communities,
Yes.
everything's out of whack.
Oh, well, sure. I mean, there was
Because you're well.
I was doing a presentation and they literally knew that a house had sold and somebody had moved out and they could tell by the calculation, like effectively when that had happened. Yeah.
What would they
It's
do?
wild. My buddy is the former business manager in Lincoln.
Okay.
And I was looking at one of his budget presentations from a couple years ago, and he showed the number of houses on the market in the prior fiscal year and the number of bedrooms. So the number of houses that had 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, it went up to 7 bedrooms. And then the number for the following fiscal year, and I guess the impact on then.
I mean, that among other things can impact student enrollment. We're having that argument in my own community.
We looked at in our town, how our student population went way down and
Yep.
moving in.
Right.
Not many people were children.
Well, and part, by the way, the reason that the calculation in terms of contribution has both halves, it I'm sure has occurred to all of you that the town doesn't get anything from income taxes. That was actually intended to be a way of rebalancing the property-rich but income-poor communities. Because the Cape and the Berkshires in particular complain that, sure, we've got lots of property on the rolls, but there's a lot of people who don't actually live here most of the time.
Right. And what about the valuation of land in what is
State-owned
land?
No,
I was
it's
thinking of land in agricultural, what is it, 61D?
Yeah, 30.
Conservation.
Well, you, right,
No, not conservation.
No, 62, chapter 60, that's when they can get
They
pay
say,
less in taxes.
yeah,
because
they
it's
pay less
used
in
for health.
taxes because, but it's not necessarily like fully conserved, right? Like,
Right.
It's not in every
Yeah.
community. So let's say you've got a great town like Northfield that has a fair amount of land, that's taxable, but it's not being taxed at a high rate because it's in that agricultural program. Is there a consideration for that in this formula?
it's taxable value, so it's not necessarily the actual level of the being taxed. Which I believe is actually intended to counter exactly that.
Can you say that again?
It's taxable value,
Okay.
right? So it's not necessarily how much it's being taxed. I believe that there is actually a record, I would need to go look. And honestly, I should know this.
But that creates a gap between what you say the property value is and what the actual taxes
Taxes
are.
that are coming in,
Yeah.
but, right, and
And
so
they
that's,
don't.
but that, I mean, that effectively then puts it into that same category of, they're also calculating some of this based on income and you don't get anything from that either.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that's where EQV comes in, because why did EQV jump? 2 years ago, was it? I mean, 20%.
Yeah.
And we got killed on assessments.
Because
The
people bought
Franklin
houses?
Regional Council of Government, no, it was just the value. The value of the land, like when you do a reval, and the state always wants to put you at, is it 95%?
I honestly don't know. Yeah, the state does,
I think
I mean,
it-
that was sort of that earlier conversation where I was like, the state does come through every so often and say, you know, how much are you cooking the books or do we need to cook in the books?
They look at that and then they balance you out, and then, like this year, I know, because I'm on the FERPA budget, subcommittee, I think it's Row went up huge EQV, huge, but Row has a very low tax rate, so it's not.
So you do, the town does
What's their
a
tax rate,
assessment
$8
every 3
per
years.
thousand or something. So for them, they're gonna see an increase in taxes,
Yep.
but it's not like us who pay 20 something per thousand
Mhm.
or otherwise.
Right.
No, like-
What is, curiosity, what does Worcester pay for that?
Oh, I have to go look.
We have, and I say that only because we have this very tiresome argument because we have a commercial tax rate and a residential tax rate. And there's always this battle at city council of how, are they gonna be the same, are they gonna be different, how much are they gonna be different? And I honestly just get.
But that's our reality. The cap's 25. We're running, 21, 22. I mean, we're getting up there.
We're getting close. Different kind of question. Bernardston has a cannabis growing facility.
Yep.
They will have a dispensary.
Yep.
They'll get one. Yeah, so the next country is right on Route, Interstate 91. Let's pretend that goes gangbusters.
Yep.
What's that?
It is already.
Are they open as a dispensary?
Community well can go up.
No,
Its size has gotten.
Oh, it's huge, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
They're building a massive thing. So let's pretend that is very financially successful. That would have an impact on Bernardston's municipal growth.
I would, yes.
Yeah.
In fact, that's probably the first place you'd see it because you're not necessarily gonna see it in the property value. But you probably are gonna see it in terms of what the town economy did. Yeah.
It's like a casino, where's all that money going for marijuana and casino? Not coming to us and gas, we should. And that 635 number, sorry, I think you might have answered this before.
Yep.
Let's say we get 20 additional school choice students next year from above what we have this year. That will or will not show up in that particular,
It won't show up now.
because they're not showing up in our
Foundation
foundation
budget.
loan.
Yep,
Okay.
exactly.
These are resident kids.
These are resident kids. And they're resident kids even if they choice somewhere else, even if they
These are
choose.
just the resident.
Yep.
So what I would like to see, and it doesn't have to be done here, but I would like to see how many more children we need to have to help us.
That is
Because we're, just assume we're only gonna get 20,000 more for the next 3 years, or 5. I mean, anything can happen,
Anything
but
can happen.
I'm looking at sustainability. For us, and only
Exercise.
20,000. And but how much, do we need 100 kids? Do we need 50? I mean, I think we're talking a lot of children.
You are. You're talking to get back up to the
To get back up
1,200.
there.
Yeah.
And I don't know how.
And I mean, the other piece that I would play with is if you play out over the next couple of years, assuming your poverty rate stays as it is, what does that end up looking like? How effectively, where does that get you in terms of students? And I don't know the answer to that question.
See, I don't see the poverty level going up much.
Mhm.
I mean, Bernard.
Which, by the way, of course, is good news, right?
Yeah. Because people can't move out here and afford the housing
Yeah.
right now. They can't
You can't be
afford
here without a car.
Right,
the transportation, right?
Work here in a way.
You're
This-
gonna have little different things happen.
There's an interesting phenomenon though. People are moving out from Boston, they're moving out here, and they're buying houses for 2-3 times the value, but they don't have kids.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And so maybe the
That's what
community
happens.
wealth's gonna go up, but it's not helping the schools.
It's not actually gonna change your enrollment. You had your hand up.
Yeah, remind me how homeschool students fit into.
They don't, they don't exist effectively.
Okay.
Yep. So this is not actually all of the children in your town. It's all of the children who are attending some sort of public education who live in your town.
Or we are financially responsible.
But if we brought them back into the public schools, that
Sure.
would increase.
They would increase this number,
Just
yeah,
like new families.
absolutely.
So that should be part of our long-term.
That's right.
But homeschool kids can play sports.
By your, depending on
Depends
your
on the local
policy,
policy.
Yep.
So there's not a state law that says they have to be allowed, it's what our school committee.
matter of local
Are you
discretion.
sure about that?
Yeah.
Because I remember reviewing that policy with you all.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's true. I think if a homeschool kid is entitled to,
No, it's a matter of local discretion.
It's local
It's left,
policy.
it's
did they
local.
change that? Because that was not always the
It's been
case.
true for
Okay,
10 years or more, I
that
think.
Yeah.
surprises me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Interesting.
we should make sure our policy is very clear.
Maybe
So
that's
that
a
is
good
all that I have for you.
Oh, that was great.
Thank you,
Tracy.
And I guess so just so you know, obviously this is the piece, this is the cycle, just so that you all know that.
I would love to wait that.
Yeah.
Now
I've
I
seen,
know so
I've seen a lot of these. This is probably the best one.
I'm very fond of this Lego presentation. I saw it, I was like, this is the whole story, this is how they put together, yes, yes. So that's actually then how you all know this, if I were doing this with a group of, so school committee having it would be more useful.
Thank you. We will post Tracy's presentation online. And we'll also provide links to the, I'll pull up the full worksheet. Sure. So we'll provide links to some of the places on the DESI website where you get these figures, but I'll also post the actual worksheet, big workbook. And what you do is you type in Pioneer Valley, and then all kinds of magic happens at different times. So we'll make sure that that's posted.
Patricia, do you think there would be value, and I don't know if you have the time, but would be value to, when we're getting to the end of our budget cycle, to have her present something to the towns, even remotely, for the next piece of how this gets assessed out?
You mean the 5-year rolling average of?
And all that stuff, because that's always the biggest thing, like, we went up 12% and this town went down.
I think actually Judy, because we yesterday and today we're talking about, and she reached out to Chris to get the, by our regional agreement, it's the October and December 1 enrollments, is that right, for the past 5 years? Right?
Yeah.
So that's an hour agreement, that's how it works. I think Judy could probably do that.
Okay, great.
Yep, I agree with you, I think Judy's actually really good, yep. Great, yeah.
Question. So the required contribution, what's the relationship with our budget town assessment?
So that's where it starts, right? So that's the thing that the state says, you at a minimum have to contribute this much, right? And then the next step is what was just talking about.
Is what we asked.
Yes, and that's always based on what you as a committee set as your budget, and then how that breaks down to each of the towns.
And am I right that if you think about this as, there's the required business from the state, that portion, if you think of a column for all 4 towns, that portion of it is weighted by the town's economic capacity.
Yes.
But the second part of it is not weighted. Right. by the town's
Depending on
economic
regional agreement, yes.
Right, and so that, I think, is where we get into some,
And from what I see, right, from what I see, this also is very often the crux of where some of the disagreements lie, because towns kind of, that's why I said, like, when people went, oh, right, like, if your town is one of the maximum contribution towns, and you're next to a town where effectively your contribution is 55% state aid, that's kind of invisible unless you have this, but you're gonna feel it, right? And that's gonna be like, you're gonna be butting heads over it without anyone ever having said, oh, well, that's because your town doesn't have as much money, right? I mean, like, and I think that's something that people should actually have on the table.
Would it be more advantageous for us to change the regional agreement to go on the foundation budget?
Or to use this, I mean, I think that at least opening the conversation about how much sort of relative wealth people are bringing to the table. Now, the other half of this, and I always remind half of this, is that if you have a poor community, those poor communities are why you're getting more state aid. That's right. So remember, that's the other half of the equation, because I've had, the hands-on hip, well, we're contributing, yeah, okay, but they're the ones that are actually maybe involved in contributing, so.
On the other hand, I just had a comment made to me by a select board member and said, well, Leiden has always paid well above our contribution, and it got us nowhere because they closed our school. And so that there's that kind of feeling, too, because we've always been generous with our school budget, way above what we're supposed to pay.
And I mean, it's particularly hard when it's one of the smaller towns, thus with the smaller enrollment, but has sort of a larger amount of wealth relatively, right? So that's why I say being able to compare your combined effort yield to your foundation budget can be useful. But that doesn't necessarily help you in saying, well, you paid more, so we're going to keep your school open, even though from a regional perspective, that doesn't necessarily work.
We could make a couple easy to read charts that show the 4 towns and show, for instance, their that distribution on the bottom left of the things that show their target amount there, so that people see them in relation to each other.
Yeah.
I've always known we were high.
Absolutely. No, I mean, just over the line from me is Wachusett, and that's sort of the Princeton
Oh, yeah.
versus Rutland versus
Yeah.
Oldham conversation.
I grew up in Derry.
Okay, so
There's
there's a similar story there, although they don't seem to kind of light things on fire in the same way that Rutland always appears to be kind of burn the district down.
Yeah.
Usually, I grew up in Sterling, so, yes, so that I think is a good idea, to at least have sort of that on the table of, let's remember that towns are coming to this from different ways.
So you're so ingrained in this foundation and how this works. From a political perspective, do you have any thoughts about, so this is gonna run to 2027?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts of positions that smaller districts like ours could bring forward as they the legislatures start thinking about the new foundation formula and what kind of things they might be able to introduce in there that could help? There's a lot of districts in our situation.
Yes, so I mean, I think, the rural report that came out, was that 2
Commission,
years
yeah.
ago, right? That actually had, there was a DESI report that came out that actually had a couple of things. Oh, you know what, it was from the auditor's office, that's what it is.
It's bump.
Right,
Isn't it auditor bump?
yes,
Yeah.
who of course is doing it from the perspective of actually having lived in Great Barrington and gone through their
Yeah.
annual,
Yeah.
speaking of another like town and then smaller town.
Yeah.
So they had a couple of proposals that certainly were controversial. Rural aid obviously is one of them, right? And that seems to have actually finally been accepted by everyone. The governor actually put it in his budget this year and at a level that he hasn't previously ever. So, go Berkshire County Senators because they were the ones that made that happen. So that question of, is there a rurality factor is I think probably a fair one to ask. The other one was contrary-wise, looking at the local contribution. It was pointed out in the auditor's report that once you start getting into some of the regional districts, particularly some of the larger ones, you're getting into something that's closer to the model of the county schools in other parts of the country, who can then actually assess their own taxes, because then they're looking at the whole thing. That was actually part of her proposal, was that the regional school districts actually become effectively their own tax. Now, obviously, that opens a whole different can of worms and something that we don't have anything quite like that in Massachusetts. And then how you work that out with the regional low tax. But that was in the report. And in terms of how are you going to pay for it, at least, right? That doesn't solve the problems of this is the number of kids we have over this many square miles, and how are we going to simply educate them? But in terms of how you're going to pay for it, that was sort of the other thing they suggested. So, we're probably at least starting to maybe entertain those proposals, or at least talk them up in terms of would that work, would that solve things, how much difference would it make?
On the other hand, I feel that we're pitting ourselves against each other, district to district.
Yes.
And I was just in Florida last week talking to people from Canada, and they really put it into perspective. They said, you talk about our high taxes that we have. If you make $100,000 in Canada, $50,000 goes towards taxes. It pays for your schools, your health insurance. Every school is the same.
Yep.
So you're not kidding. And I thought, oh my God, I'd happily pay.
Me too.
I would too. I would too.
Didn't have help or
But the real wealthy communities will.
Well, and that was part of that's sort of been part of the conversation that I raised before when we talked about the health insurance percentage, right? So what is the answer to your health insurance percentage is going up by 8%, but the foundation only recognizes 4.5? Probably single payer. I mean, it's the fact that the school districts are all having to independently carry health insurance. That's why when we get into these conversations of, it costs so much less to educate kids in our place, that's because the government pays for healthcare. That's your second largest cost, or maybe it's your third, depending on transportation, but it's a big chunk of your budget. And that's just simply not carried by lots of places. So there's my radical flaming socialism for you. But do keep in mind that you carry a cost that isn't carried every place. And I think that that's a fair thing to make sure. I always point out, by the way, to municipals, because sometimes it's not actually carried on the municipal district's books. It's carried on the city.
Of the town.
And I always say, remember, you're paying for that. That when the state actually sees what you have, it counts. So make sure that you actually are remembering that that's counted on your books too. Yeah. So that's part of that story, absolutely.
Yeah, I was like, oh.
Nice job.
Great.
Tracy, thank you so much.
Oh, just let's do it.
Absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a totally unrelated question.
Well, great.
Do you, what do you know